Two boys walked into a high school on a Tuesday morning in April and killed 13 people. They wounded 24 more, then they killed themselves. The whole thing lasted under 50 minutes. That's the short version. Here's what actually happened, and why, 25 years later, we still haven't fully made sense of it. Littleton, Colorado, in 1999, was exactly the kind of place where nothing like this was supposed to happen. It sat in the southern suburbs of Denver. Clean streets, good schools, new construction spreading outward into the foothills. The median household income was well above the national average. The crime rate was low. The high school had a good football team, a good theater program, and a student body of roughly 2,000 kids. It was, by every measurable standard, a success story. A town that had done everything right. Columbine High School had been open since 1973. By 1999, it was the kind of school that produced state champions and college-bound graduates in roughly equal proportion. The building itself was sprawling. A maze of hallways, a large cafeteria, a library on the second floor, and a commons area where students gathered between classes. On most days it was loud and ordinary. Students ate lunch, teachers graded papers. The parking lot filled up at 7:15 in the morning and emptied out by 3 in the afternoon. Eric Harris was 17 years old. He had moved to Littleton with his family in 1993 when his father, a retired Air Force transport pilot, took a civilian job nearby. Eric was the younger of two sons. He had lived in multiple states before Colorado: New York, Michigan, Ohio. The pattern of a military family that followed orders and adapted. He was described by teachers as bright, articulate, and mature for his age. He played Little League baseball. He liked video games. He wanted to study computer science. Dylan Klebold was also 17. He had grown up in Littleton, the son of a geophysicist father and a vocational counselor mother. He was taller than Eric by several inches, 6'2" by the time he was a junior, and quieter. People who knew him in his earlier years remembered a kid who was genuinely funny, who loved bowling, who had a gift for computers and for math. His parents were devoted. His home life was stable. Nothing in his background announced what was coming. The two boys met in middle school and became close friends around 1996, the year they both entered Columbine as freshmen. They shared a love of video games, particularly Doom. They both worked part-time at a local pizza restaurant called Blackjack Pizza. They spent hours together in Eric's basement, building computers, watching movies, recording homemade videos that were strange and occasionally disturbing, but that nobody outside their immediate circle ever saw. What was happening underneath the surface is something we have spent 25 years trying to understand. Eric Harris kept a website. He started it in 1996, initially as a place to share Doom levels he'd created. Over time, it became something else. He began posting rants about people he hated at school, about specific students by name, about his contempt for what he called stupid people. By 1997, some of the posts were explicit enough that the parents of a student named Brooks Brown filed a complaint with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. They handed investigators printed pages from the site. The pages included statements about wanting to kill Brooks Brown specifically. They included instructions for making pipe bombs. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office received that complaint in 1997. They drafted an affidavit for a search warrant of the Harris home. The affidavit detailed the threatening posts, the weapons references, and a pipe bomb that Eric had apparently already built. The search warrant was never filed. The investigation was shelved. No one followed up. That decision, to let it sit, would later become one of the most examined institutional failures in the entire case. Dylan Klebold's inner world was harder to read, and in some ways more painful. He kept a journal. It doesn't read like a manifesto. It reads like the diary of someone who is deeply, genuinely depressed, who writes about loneliness and self-loathing and a desperate, unfulfilled need to be loved. He wrote about a girl he had feelings for and never acted on. He wrote about not feeling real. He wrote about hating himself far more than he ever wrote about hating other people. The journal entries run alongside the planning for what he and Eric were building toward, and reading them together is disorienting. The same notebook that contains plans for violence also contains the confessions of a teenager who wanted, more than anything, to feel like he belonged somewhere. Eric and Dylan were not universally hated at school. That is one of the persistent myths that grew up around Columbine. That they were isolated outcasts who snapped under the weight of relentless bullying. The reality is more complicated. They had a friend group. They were part of a loose social cluster sometimes referred to in press coverage as the Trench Coat Mafia, though that label was applied retroactively and exaggerated. They ate lunch together. They had conversations with classmates that, in hindsight, seemed normal. Some people who knew them well were genuinely shocked. Others, when they thought back, remembered things that had unsettled them at the time. In January 1998, Eric and Dylan were caught breaking into a van and stealing tools. They were arrested, charged, and enrolled in a juvenile diversion program, a court-supervised rehabilitation track that required community service, counseling, and clean behavior to complete. Both boys completed it. Their records were expunged. Eric's counselor noted that he seemed polite, responsible, and remorseful. What the counselor didn't know, what nobody knew, was that by this point Eric Harris had already started keeping another kind of journal. Not a personal diary, a planning document. He called it his Book of God. Later, investigators would call it the basement tapes. The planning took approximately a year. Eric began writing in his journal in earnest in late 1997, though the specific target, Columbine itself, solidified over 1998. Dylan's journal suggests he was fully committed to the plan by late 1998. Both boys recorded video diaries in Eric's basement. Long, rambling monologues about their contempt for the world, their plans for what they were going to do, and the reason they believed it was justified. These tapes were viewed by investigators and a small number of journalists, but were never released publicly. Jefferson County Sheriff's Office made the decision not to release them on the grounds that doing so could inspire imitation. The decision remains controversial. What they were planning was not, at first, primarily a shooting. The original plan, the plan that Eric Harris wrote about extensively, and that both boys discussed in the basement tapes, was a bombing. They intended to park 2 propane tank bombs in the Columbine cafeteria during the lunch period, timed to detonate when the room was at maximum capacity. The cafeteria held up to 500 students during peak lunch hour. The bombs, if they had worked, would have killed most of them. Then, according to the plan, Eric and Dylan would position themselves outside the school's exits and shoot survivors as they tried to escape. They spent months acquiring the materials. They bought propane tanks from hardware stores. They constructed pipe bombs from parts purchased individually to avoid detection. They bought the guns legally through private sales and gun shows, a category of transaction that, under Colorado law at the time, did not require background checks. A friend named Robin Anderson helped them buy 3 of the weapons at a gun show in December 1998. She later said she hadn't known what they intended to do with them. A 4th weapon, a TECDC-9 semi-automatic pistol, was purchased separately through an acquaintance named Mark Maines, who later pled guilty to a charge related to the sale. In total, Eric and Dylan assembled an arsenal that included 2 12-gauge shotguns, a 9mm carbine rifle, the TECDC-9, and approximately 99 improvised explosive devices of various types. The IEDs included the 2 large propane tank bombs intended for the cafeteria, smaller pipe bombs to be thrown at students and first responders, and crude devices placed along roads near the school, intended to delay or kill police. The scale of what they were preparing was not hidden from anyone who looked closely. Eric's journal entries from early 1999 describe the plan in specific, operational detail. Dylan wrote about it as well. At some point, we don't know exactly when, both boys seem to have accepted that they would die that day. Eric wrote about it with a kind of dark clarity. Dylan wrote about it with something closer to relief. April 20th was chosen for a reason. The date marked the 110th anniversary of Adolf Hitler's birth. There has been debate among investigators and psychologists about how significant the ideology was to either boy, whether it was genuine ideological conviction or performance, a borrowed language of contempt for the world. The evidence suggests Eric, in particular, was drawn to the imagery and the philosophy of nihilism, of contempt for weakness, of a kind of self-styled superiority. Dylan's engagement with those ideas seems more complicated. Less conviction, more despair. The night before, April 19th, both boys recorded final video messages in Eric's basement. They talked about their families, they expressed something that sounded in places like regret, not for what they were about to do, but for the pain their families would feel. Eric told his parents, directly to the camera, that they had been good parents and that none of this was their fault. Dylan said something similar. Then they went to sleep. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Dylan Klebold wrote a final journal entry. It was short. He described waking up, feeling at peace, being ready. He wrote about love. He wrote about reaching a higher state. Then he closed the journal and got dressed. The morning was ordinary for everyone except them. By 11:10 a.m., both boys had arrived at Columbine in separate cars. They were wearing black trench coats. Standard clothing for them, nothing that raised alarms. They carried duffel bags into the cafeteria and set them down near the support columns. Inside each bag was a propane tank bomb with a timer set to detonate at 11:17, peak lunch period when the cafeteria would be at full capacity. They left the bags and went back to their cars. The bombs did not go off. The exact reason the main bombs failed has never been definitively established. Investigators concluded that the timers malfunctioned. A wiring issue, most likely. If those bombs had worked, the death toll at Columbine would have been measured not in dozens but in hundreds. What followed instead was, by the standard of what they had planned, a contingency. At 11:19 a.m., Eric and Dylan returned to the top of the grassy hill on the west side of the school, adjacent to the parking lot. They were armed. They began shooting. The first victims were outside. Rachel Scott, 17 years old, was sitting on the grass near the school's west entrance eating lunch with a friend named Richard Castaldo. She was shot 4 times. She was killed immediately. Richard was shot 8 times and survived, though he was paralyzed from the chest down. Daniel Rohrbaugh, 15, was shot near the school's entrance doors as he tried to run. He was hit in the chest and died where he fell. Several other students were shot in the parking lot and on the grassy area. Some were wounded. Some ran. Some lay still, not certain whether it was safer to move. The first calls to 911 began coming in at approximately 11:20. Inside the school, a teacher named William Sanders heard the shooting and began moving through the building, warning students, directing them to safety. He would be shot before the morning was over. Eric and Dylan entered the building through the west entrance at approximately 11:22 a.m. They threw pipe bombs as they moved. They shot at students in the hallways. They moved toward the cafeteria, looked down into it from the top of a staircase, and fired into the room. The cafeteria, the room where the bombs had been placed, the room where the plan had required hundreds to die, was now largely empty because the fire alarm, triggered by a small exterior fire, one of their pipe bombs had prompted many students to evacuate. The cafeteria death toll was not what they had planned. They went to the library. The library is where the largest concentration of killing happened. At 11:29 a.m., Eric and Dylan entered the school library on the second floor. There were approximately 52 students in the room when they entered. Most of them had hidden under tables and desks after hearing the shooting elsewhere in the building. A teacher named Patty Nielsen had attempted to call 911 from the library. She was wounded in the hallway approaching the library entrance and had crawled behind the library counter. She stayed on the line with 911 throughout what followed. What happened in the library over the next 8 minutes was the core of the killing. Eric and Dylan moved through the room. They taunted students. They made specific choices about who to shoot. Several of the killings in the library were targeted. Students were asked questions before being shot. Some witnesses described the killers laughing. Some described them as eerily calm. Some described them as furious and erratic. 10 students died in the library. 12 were injured. The others, all but a handful of the 52, survived by staying hidden and staying silent and not moving until it was over. Cassie Bernal, 17, was shot in the library. A false account circulated in the weeks after the shooting, claiming she had been asked whether she believed in God and had answered yes before being shot. That story was widely repeated and became one of the most emotionally resonant narratives to emerge from Columbine. It was not true. Investigation established that the exchange attributed to Cassie had actually occurred with a different student, Feline Schnurr, who survived. Cassie Bernal was not asked that question. She was simply killed. The false story persisted for years because it gave people something meaningful to hold on to. The truth offered less comfort. Isaiah Schulz, 18, was targeted because he was black. Witnesses heard racial slurs directed at him before he was shot. Daniel Mauser, 15. Corey DePuter, 17. Lauren Townsend, 18. John Tomlin, 16. Kelly Fleming, 16. Matthew Kechter, 16. Kyle Velasquez, 16. Stephen Kerno, 14. 10 students. In 8 minutes. In a school library. In a suburb that had done everything right. At approximately 11:36, Eric and Dylan left the library. The students who had survived stayed hidden. What happened in the next 25 minutes is less clearly documented. Eric and Dylan moved through parts of the school, detonated several smaller devices, went back to the cafeteria, and attempted unsuccessfully to trigger the large propane bombs by shooting at them. They wounded several more students. The building was now being evacuated in waves. Teachers were moving students out of classrooms, through windows and side doors. SWAT teams had arrived and were staging outside but were not yet entering the building. The standard law enforcement doctrine of the time called for containment, establishing a perimeter, waiting for the situation to stabilize. The idea that police should enter an active shooting immediately and confront the shooter had not yet become standard procedure. Columbine, in part, would change that. Teacher Dave Sanders was shot twice in the upper body around 11:25 in a hallway on the first floor. Students and a teacher barricaded themselves with him in a science classroom and began trying to keep him alive. A student held a sign in the window reading, "One bleeding to death." SWAT teams saw the sign. It would be nearly 3 hours before help reached that room. Dave Sanders died at approximately 3 p.m. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold returned to the library at approximately 12:02 p.m. The students who had hidden there were still hiding. They were alive. The two boys moved to the windows and fired several shots at the police vehicles outside. Then they shot themselves. Eric Harris died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Dylan Klebold died of the same. The shooting was over. The library students began to realize gradually, through the silence, that it might be safe to move. SWAT teams entered the building in stages through the afternoon, clearing room by room. The evacuation of students was chaotic and exhausting. Hundreds of students filed out of the building with their hands above their heads in the standard protocol for active shooter evacuations. A protocol that, by that April, most of them had never practiced and never thought they would need. Photographs from the evacuation, students streaming across the parking lot, hands raised, faces blank with shock, became some of the most reprinted images of the decade. The final count: 13 dead, 24 wounded, 2 perpetrators dead. The phone lines in Littleton were overwhelmed within an hour of the first shots. Parents who had heard the news drove to the school and were stopped at the perimeter. Hundreds of people gathered in the parking lot of a nearby elementary school, which had been designated as a family reunification center. They waited for hours. Some children arrived and were reunited. Others waited and kept waiting. 12 families were told, by the end of that day, that their child was not coming home. The community response was immediate and enormous. Flowers appeared outside the school within hours. A makeshift memorial on a hill near the building grew over the following days into something vast. Crosses, photographs, handwritten notes, stuffed animals, cards from schools in other states. The grieving was public in a way that felt new. People who had no connection to Columbine drove hours to stand at that hill and leave something there. The national response was also immediate. President Clinton addressed the nation on the evening of April the 20th. He called for the country to examine its relationship with violence, its gun laws, its culture. He requested a moment of silence in schools nationwide. The coverage was extraordinary in its scale and its duration. CNN broadcast from outside the school throughout the afternoon and into the night. Every major network led with Columbine for days. The images, the evacuating students, the police in tactical gear, the weeping parents were on the front page of every newspaper in the country. In the first week after the shooting, Columbine became the most covered domestic news event since the Oklahoma City bombing 4 years earlier. And in that coverage, a narrative began to form that was, in many ways, wrong. The Trenchcoat Mafia story. The idea that Eric and Dylan had been part of a distinct, identifiable fringe group of Gothic-adjacent outsiders who had been systematically bullied and had retaliated, was repeated by news outlets, pundits, and politicians. The bullying narrative in particular took hold quickly and powerfully. It felt like an explanation. It had a clean moral shape. The outcasts struck back. The popular kids and the culture that produced them were to blame. Subsequent investigation, including a major psychological study commissioned by the Secret Service, complicated this picture significantly. The study, called the Safe School Initiative, examined 41 school shootings and found that while many perpetrators had experienced some form of bullying, the experience of being bullied was neither a consistent nor a sufficient predictor of violence. Most bullied students did not become shooters. The shooters were not all social outcasts. Eric Harris, in particular, showed characteristics less consistent with a victimized outsider than with what researchers would later describe as a clinically psychopathic individual. Someone who lacked empathy, experienced others primarily as objects, and had constructed an elaborate self-justifying worldview. The gun show loophole narrative was the other major policy conversation that emerged from Columbine. Colorado held a referendum in November 2000 on whether to require background checks for private gun sales. 70% of Colorado voters approved it. A parallel federal measure, known as the Gun Show Loophole Closing Act, was introduced in Congress multiple times and never passed. The cultural conversation was broader and stranger. The entertainment industry was scrutinized. Video games, and specifically Doom, which Eric Harris played obsessively and had modified to create custom levels, were examined by Congress. Marilyn Manson, whose music both boys had reportedly listened to, became a symbol of a moral panic that had been building throughout the 1990s. A documentary filmmaker named Michael Moore would later make Bowling for Columbine, which won an Academy Award and which addressed these cultural anxieties with a degree of irony that not everyone appreciated. None of it produced a clean answer. None of it was supposed to. What followed, over the months and years after April 20th, was a slow accumulation of institutional failures being brought into the light. The 1997 complaint to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office was the most significant. The Browns had handed investigators pages from Eric's website. Pages that described specific individuals by name, that expressed explicit desires to kill, that referenced bomb construction. An investigator named Michael Guerra had drafted a search warrant affidavit. That affidavit concluded there was probable cause to search the Harris home. It was never submitted. The reason is not entirely clear. Guerra later said he couldn't recall the specifics of why it wasn't filed. The affidavit itself was not disclosed to the public until years after the shooting. It was discovered by a Denver journalist who noticed a discrepancy in the official timeline. When it came out, the response was a combination of outrage and exhaustion. Here was a document that might have changed everything. It had existed in 1997. Nobody had done anything with it. Jefferson County Sheriff John Stone and the department's handling of both the pre-shooting intelligence failures and the post-shooting investigation became a source of sustained criticism. The department was accused of slow-walking the release of information, of being more concerned with its own legal exposure than with transparency. The 11,000-page investigative file was released incrementally and under pressure. The basement tapes were never released publicly. A lawsuit filed by victims' families over the department's handling of the case resulted in a settlement. The SWAT response on the day itself was also re-examined extensively. Under the prevailing law enforcement doctrine in 1999, first responders established a perimeter and waited. It took SWAT teams approximately 3 hours to reach Dave Sanders, who bled to death waiting for help that could see the sign in the window and couldn't reach him in time. After Columbine, law enforcement agencies across the country revised their active shooter protocols. The new doctrine, enter immediately, confront the threat, don't wait, became standard. It has been credited with saving lives in subsequent incidents. It came from the lesson of watching what happened when they waited. The Jefferson County coroner's handling of the timeline created its own controversy. Initial reports placed the death of Cassie Bernal in a context that supported the false martyrdom account. The correction took weeks to fully filter through the public record, and by then the story had been published in books, broadcast on television, and was being cited in sermons. The school itself was the subject of ongoing debate. Some families wanted the building demolished, believed it should not stand. The community eventually decided to renovate rather than destroy. The library where most of the killings had occurred was replaced. A new atrium was built over the space where the library had been. The 13 who died were Rachel Scott, 17. She was the first killed, outside on the grass. She had written in her diary that she wanted to change the world and that she believed she would, though she might not live to see it. Her father, Darrell Scott, became a public advocate for a message of compassion and community. He spoke before Congress. He founded an organization called Rachel's Challenge that delivers anti-bullying and kindness programs to schools. Daniel Rorbo, 15. His father, Brian Rorbo, became one of the most vocal and controversial voices in the Columbine aftermath, insisting that there had been a cover-up, that some of the timeline published by authorities was wrong, and that questions about the shooting had not been answered honestly. His anger never abated. For years, he kept fighting. Dave Sanders, 47. The only teacher killed. He had spent the first minutes of the shooting moving through the building, warning students. He saved a number of lives before he was shot. He was a father and a grandfather. His daughter spoke at his memorial. His students created a fund in his name. Isaiah Schulz, 18. The only black student killed. His parents became advocates for awareness about how racial targeting had been inadequately addressed in the public coverage of the shooting. Cassie Bernal, 17. Lauren Townsend, 18. John Tomlin, 16. Kelly Fleming, 16. Daniel Mauser, 15. Matthew Kechter, 16. Kyle Velasquez, 16. Stephen Kerno, 14. Corey DePuter, 17. 17 families changed forever in 50 minutes on a Tuesday morning in April. The survivors carried the event differently. Some spoke publicly. Some disappeared from the public conversation entirely. Richard Castaldo, who had been eating lunch with Rachel Scott and was paralyzed in the first seconds of the shooting, became an advocate for gun reform. Patrick Ireland, the student seen crawling out of the library window on live television, bleeding from gunshot wounds to the head and foot, being caught by SWAT officers on the ground below, made a full recovery and graduated from Columbine the following year. He was valedictorian. The parents of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were never charged with any crime. They largely disappeared from public life. Dylan's mother, Susan Klebold, broke her silence in 2016 with a memoir titled A Mother's Reckoning. She wrote about the decade and a half she spent trying to understand how she had not seen what was coming, about grief and guilt and the question that never fully leaves: what did I miss? What could I have done? She has said that she loved her son and that she mourns him and that she also knows what he did. Holding both of those things at once has defined the rest of her life. Tom and Linda Klebold declined most public requests for years. Wayne and Kathy Harris were sued by victims' families and reached a settlement. They have never spoken publicly about their son. The word Columbine entered the language in a way that no school's name should. In the years after 1999, it became a reference point, a before and after. Schools began running lockdown drills. The term active shooter entered standard law enforcement training. Security measures that had been unthinkable in American schools became normal. Metal detectors, clear backpacks, security cameras, armed resource officers, locked exterior doors during school hours. An entire industry emerged around school security. Consultants sold training programs. Politicians voted for hardening measures. The question of whether any of it worked, whether making schools look more like prisons made them safer, or whether it made them feel unsafe in ways that damaged the children inside them, became a running argument in education policy that has never been resolved. More devastatingly, Columbine inspired imitation. Researchers who study mass violence have documented that school shootings became more frequent, and that a significant portion of the perpetrators studied Columbine specifically, read about it, watched coverage of it, expressed admiration for Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold in their own writings before carrying out their own attacks. The Columbine effect, the phenomenon of a mass shooting inspiring others, became a recognized research area. The decision not to release the basement tapes was, in part, made with this phenomenon in mind. The Virginia Tech shooting in 2007. 32 killed. Sandy Hook in 2012. 20 children between 6 and 7 years old. 6 staff members. Parkland in 2018. 17 killed. Uvalde in 2022. 19 children, 2 teachers. The list goes on and extends beyond schools. The pattern: a perpetrator with documented warning signs, a firearms acquisition process that was legal or barely illegal, a law enforcement response under scrutiny, a national conversation that produced grief and argument in roughly equal measure, and then moved on. Repeats with a regularity that has become its own kind of horror. Columbine did not cause all of this, but it sits at the origin of something. It was the event that made the phrase school shooting into a category. Before Columbine, mass shootings at schools were not unheard of. There had been incidents at elementary and high schools going back decades. But Columbine was the one that lodged in the collective memory. The one that became a template. The one that the country has been trying to process and prevent and explain ever since, with genuinely mixed results. The Jefferson County investigation closed. Officially, the case was considered cleared. But the questions did not close with it. The first is the simplest and the hardest. Why? The answer depends on which framework you apply. If you approach it as a mental health story, the answer is something like, Eric Harris showed characteristics consistent with psychopathy. A grandiose self-image, lack of remorse, contempt for others, a pattern of calculated deception. Dylan Klebold showed characteristics consistent with severe depression. Self-loathing, hopelessness, a kind of passive ideation that attached itself to Eric's more active planning. The two boys amplified each other's worst tendencies in a dynamic that psychologists would later call co-rumination, a spiral in which shared grievances and shared fantasies became more extreme through repetition. If you approach it as a social and cultural story, the answer is different. Two teenagers in a culture saturated with violence, with accessible weapons, with a media environment that had romanticized the idea of going out in a blaze of infamy, chose to do something they had been given, in some sense, all the tools to imagine. If you approach it as a failure of system story, the answer is different again. A 1997 complaint was ignored. A search warrant was drafted and shelved. A juvenile diversion program cleared both boys without flagging the escalating warning signs visible in Eric's journal. A gun show allowed 3 of the 4 weapons to be acquired without a background check. None of these frameworks is complete. None of them is wrong. They operate simultaneously. They always do in events like this. The search for a single cause that would make the whole thing make sense has never produced one. Not because the event was inexplicable, but because human violence almost never reduces to a single explanation. The second question, who else knew, and what did they do? Several students later admitted they had heard Eric or Dylan say things that, in retrospect, were warnings. One student had been told by Eric, in the months before April 20th, not to come to school that day. There were others who had heard things and said nothing, or who had said something to adults who didn't act on it. The moral weight of those choices, the knowledge that someone might have been able to stop it and didn't, is something that survivors and their families have had to live with. So have the people who knew and stayed silent. The silence was not always cowardice. Sometimes it was disbelief. Sometimes it was the calculation, rational in ordinary circumstances, catastrophically wrong in this one. That kids say dark things and usually don't mean them. The third question, and maybe the most enduring, what do we do now? Columbine produced a generation of school safety legislation at the state level. It produced federal discussions about gun laws that mostly didn't become gun laws. It produced a body of research on targeted school violence that has genuinely improved our understanding of how these events develop and what warning signs precede them. It produced the FBI's behavioral threat assessment model, which now forms the basis of threat assessment programs in schools across the country. Those programs have identified and interrupted potential attacks. That is real. That matters. It did not produce the change that would make events like it stop happening. 25 years after Columbine, schools in the United States still conduct active shooter drills. Children in elementary schools still practice hiding under their desks. The debate about guns, about mental health funding, about school security, about the cultural conditions that produce this kind of violence continues. The hill near Columbine High School, where the makeshift memorial stood in April 1999, is now the site of Clement Park, a public space with a permanent memorial. The names are inscribed, the stories are preserved. On April 20th of each year, people still come. The Secret Service's Safe School Initiative, published in 2002, established that school shooters are rarely the unknowable, out-of-nowhere figures of myth. In the majority of cases studied, the attacker had communicated their intent beforehand, to a friend, online, in a journal, in passing comments that were heard and not reported. The single most actionable finding of the entire report is simple. Someone usually knows. Someone usually hears something. The system fails when that information doesn't reach the right people in time to act on it. Dylan Klebold's mother has said that she wishes she had known about threat assessment programs when her son was alive. She has become an advocate for mental health awareness and suicide prevention. Dylan's death being, in her understanding, as much a suicide as a homicide. The act of someone who wanted to die and found in Eric's plan a vehicle for it. Eric Harris's psychology has been examined by multiple researchers and investigators. The consensus that emerged over years of study is that he was not primarily driven by grievance or by being bullied or by the things that were blamed in the immediate aftermath. He was driven by something closer to a grandiose desire for recognition, a wish to be remembered, to be known, to have his contempt for the world acknowledged. The media coverage he correctly anticipated gave him exactly that. His name is known everywhere. Dylan's name is known everywhere too. That is one of the few things both boys correctly predicted. The names of the 13 people they killed are known too, but they require more effort to remember, more intention. Rachel, Daniel, Dave, Isaiah, Cassie, Lauren, John, Kelly, Daniel, Matthew, Kyle, Stephen, Corey. 13 people who got up on a Tuesday morning in April and went to school. There is a photograph of Rachel Scott taken at the school not long before she died. She is sitting outside in the sun with a group of friends. She is laughing. She doesn't know what is coming. None of them do. The photograph looks exactly like what it is. A group of teenagers on an ordinary day in a suburb that had done everything right in a country that would spend the next 25 years trying to figure out where it had gone wrong.